The room fell into a peculiar stillness the moment Dan Bongino leaned toward the microphone. He did not raise his voice, nor did he dramatize the moment. Instead, he spoke with a calm that felt almost unsettling, as though he were delivering a routine observation, rather than issuing a challenge that would command national attention. In a tone as measured as a weather forecast, he stated that he intended to demonstrate why the individual seated before him represented, in his view, one of the most profound political deceptions ever to appear before Congress. The words landed softly, yet their weight was immediate. Inside the House Oversight Committee chamber, silence took hold. Cameras paused mid-adjustment, reporters froze with pens suspended above notebooks, and staff members who had been whispering seconds earlier now remained motionless. The atmosphere shifted as if the air itself had thickened. Then, breaking the stillness, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez laughed. It was not the laughter of surprise or discomfort. It was deliberate, rehearsed, and unmistakably performative. It carried the polish of something refined through repetition, the kind of response crafted for visual impact rather than spontaneous reaction. The laugh communicated dismissal, superiority, and confidence, projecting the impression that the speaker across from her did not merit serious consideration. It was the sort of moment that translated well into short video clips, optimized for social media platforms where perception often outweighed substance. She leaned forward, adjusting her posture as her blazer caught the overhead lighting. The garment, reportedly selected with meticulous care, reflected a strategy rather than a fashion choice. Hours earlier, her team had devoted considerable time to preparing her appearance, anticipating a confrontation that would reinforce her public image. This hearing, they believed, would produce another viral exchange in which she would emerge triumphant, dismantling yet another adversary with practiced ease. Her expression conveyed amused disbelief as she addressed the room. The implication in her tone suggested that the accusation was not merely unfounded, but absurd. She framed the moment as theatrical entertainment rather than serious inquiry, inviting observers to view the exchange as yet another predictable clash between ideological opponents. A ripple of laughter followed from her side of the chamber, and several aides instinctively reached for their phones, ready to capture what they assumed would become a widely shared highlight. At this point, she appeared entirely at ease. This environment was familiar territory. Public confrontation, sharp retorts, and performative confidence had become integral to her political identity. She continued speaking, weaving sarcasm into her remarks and positioning herself as a figure above reproach. Each sentence seemed designed less to engage with the substance of the allegation and more to reinforce her standing with a digital audience beyond the room. Throughout this exchange, Bongino remained still. His posture did not change, and his expression revealed neither irritation nor defensiveness. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, observing without interruption. The composure suggested a patience honed through years of experience in environments far more volatile than a congressional hearing. He did not react to the laughter, the sarcasm, or the applause. He simply waited. As the noise gradually subsided, the contrast became noticeable. Her energy depended on response, on visible engagement from those around her. When that response failed to materialize, a brief flicker crossed her expression. It was subtle, but present. She was unaccustomed to adversaries who declined to participate in the performance. When he finally spoke again, his voice was even and restrained. He asked a simple question, stripped of drama and delivered without emphasis. The lack of emotional charge made it more unsettling than any raised voice might have been. The exchange had shifted, though the full extent of that shift was not yet apparent. She responded with renewed confidence, dismissing him with language that framed his presence as emblematic of broader institutional failures. Her words carried the sharp edge of familiarity, the cadence of rhetoric she had deployed countless times before. Yet again, he did not interrupt. Instead, he reached down and opened his briefcase. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and entirely practical. The briefcase itself bore signs of use rather than ornamentation, suggesting function over presentation. From within, he removed a single folder. It was neither thick nor dramatic, and its appearance alone offered no indication of what it contained. He placed it carefully on the table, aligning it so that the label faced outward, visible to every camera in the room. The room stirred. Whispers moved through the gallery as observers read the typed words on the folder's surface. Bongino allowed the moment to breathe, offering no immediate explanation. He did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, he let anticipation build naturally. Understanding the power of restraint, he then spoke again, introducing a figure that carried immediate gravity. The number, delivered without embellishment, represented a sum that reframed the narrative unfolding in the room. According to the account he was presenting, it reflected the scale of financial activity connected to the subject of the hearing over a defined period. He stated it plainly, neither accusatory nor theatrical, and then paused. Only after allowing the figure to settle did he continue. He explained that the documents before him, in his telling, traced the flow of funds with specificity, detailing transfers, payments, and transactions. His gaze remained steady, as he suggested that by the conclusion of the proceedings, the audience would possess a clearer understanding of the picture he intended to present. The implication was not merely about financial records, but about trust, representation, and accountability. For the first time since the exchange began, the response from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez faltered. She appeared poised to reply, to counter with the verbal agility for which she was known. Yet no words followed immediately. The practiced rhythm of rebuttal seemed briefly disrupted, leaving a pause that felt heavier than any interruption. And with that, the narrative moved forward. The man at the witness table did not rush the moment. He opened the folder slowly, as though each second mattered, as though haste would cheapen what followed. The pages inside were arranged with precision, separated by tabs that suggested preparation rather than improvisation. His movements reflected a discipline developed over years of building cases piece by piece, understanding that persuasion often depended not on volume, but on sequence. He began by framing the discussion in deliberately narrow terms. According to the narrative he was presenting, the issue was not ideology, party affiliation, or rhetorical style. It was consistency. Specifically, the consistency between the public principles repeatedly articulated by the Congresswoman and the private choices attributed to her within this account. He described this gap not as a moral failing, but as a pattern worth examining. She responded with visible impatience. Her eyes rolled slightly, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. The suggestion that her lifestyle might be scrutinized was, in her framing, predictable and unoriginal. In her view, such criticism reflected an obsession rather than a legitimate inquiry. The tone implied that the line of questioning had already been litigated and dismissed countless times before. He clarified that the discussion was not about aesthetics or personal taste. According to his account, it was about decisions. He described them as choices that illustrated a widening distance between the rhetoric of advocacy and the reality of daily life. He then produced a document, sliding it forward so that its contents were visible to the committee. The document, as he explained it, was a lease agreement. He contextualized it within the broader themes that had defined her public messaging for years. Affordable housing, he noted, had been presented repeatedly as a fundamental right rather than a market commodity. She had spoken often about families displaced by rising rents, about workers forced to make impossible trade-offs between shelter and sustenance. Against that backdrop, he introduced the details of the residence attributed to her in this narrative. The apartment, located in a modern development in Washington, D.C., carried a monthly cost that exceeded what many families in her congressional district earned in total income over the same period. He described the building's amenities not to provoke envy, but to establish contrast. Rooftop facilities, round-the-clock services, and exclusive features were not, in his telling, inherently objectionable. They became relevant only when juxtaposed with the language of sacrifice and austerity imposed rhetorically on others. She adjusted in her chair as he spoke. Her response emphasized the structural realities of serving in Congress, including the need to maintain multiple residences. The explanation was delivered with a rehearsed confidence, as though anticipating the argument in advance. He acknowledged the logistical reality, then introduced additional material. According to the account, the next document was a comparative list. It outlined alternative housing options within close proximity to the capital, many of which were priced significantly lower. These residences, he suggested, reflected the living conditions of ordinary workers rather than political elites. The implication was not that one option was morally superior, but that the selection of the most expensive alternative was inconsistent with the ethos she publicly championed. He paused deliberately before articulating his conclusion. There was, he stated, nothing inherently wrong with ambition, comfort, or personal success. The issue arose only when those privileges were paired with a political identity constructed around denying others the same aspirations. In the version of events he presented, the problem was not wealth, but messaging. Her legal counsel leaned toward her, murmuring something inaudible to the room. She responded with a brief gesture of dismissal, signaling irritation rather than concern. The exchange suggested confidence, but also a desire to move past this line of inquiry quickly. He did not linger. Instead, he transitioned to what he described as her most defining policy initiative. The legislation, frequently cited as emblematic of her political brand, had propelled her into national prominence. He referenced speeches delivered on the House floor, statements framing climate change as an immediate and existential threat, and calls for sweeping changes to how Americans lived, traveled, and consumed resources. From the folder, he produced another set of records. In this narrative, they detailed extensive air travel over a 12-month period, all categorized under premium seating classes. The figures were introduced methodically, accompanied by contextual comparisons rather than emotional language. According to the calculation he presented, the carbon impact attributed to this travel exceeded that of numerous average households combined. The room stirred as he spoke. He framed the issue not as hypocrisy in isolation, but as selective application of sacrifice. The lifestyle changes demanded rhetorically of working families were, in his account, not reflected in her own behavior. He posed the contrast without raising his voice, allowing the implication to resonate on its own. She reached for her microphone, her tone shifting upward as she characterized the travel as necessary and official. He responded by producing a photograph. The image, he explained, depicted a moment disconnected from legislative necessity. According to the account, it showed a fundraising event at a coastal location during a period of widespread crisis elsewhere in the country. The photograph was not presented theatrically. It was simply held up, long enough for cameras to capture it, then placed gently on the table. He described the context carefully, noting that the image had briefly appeared online before being removed. The implication was not scandal for its own sake, but contrast. Within days of that moment, she had resumed public advocacy centered on environmental urgency, presenting herself as a moral authority on restraint and responsibility. Her reaction was immediate. Color rose in her face, and her hands tightened along the edge of the table. She attempted to interject, framing the trip as previously scheduled and irrelevant to the broader discussion. He interrupted calmly, indicating that explanations were less important than patterns. The narrative then shifted again, this time toward public safety. He summarized her repeated calls to reallocate funding away from traditional law enforcement, emphasizing community-based alternatives. According to the account, these arguments had been framed as both pragmatic and moral, grounded in the belief that armed policing was neither necessary nor effective in protecting vulnerable communities. From the folder, he produced financial disclosures. These documents, as he described them, outlined substantial expenditures on private security services. The figures were presented without embellishment. Their significance left to the listener to infer. In this telling, the contrast was stark. Advocacy for reduced policing paired with personal reliance on armed protection. She objected forcefully, emphasizing threats to her safety. Her argument framed personal security as a necessity rather than a luxury. He responded by broadening the scope of the discussion. The threats faced daily by ordinary residents of her district, he suggested, were no less real, even if they were less visible. The difference, in his account, was access. The silence in the room deepened. Even the ambient sounds of typing and whispering faded. The exchange no longer resembled political theater. It felt procedural, almost clinical, as though the performance had given way to examination. He proceeded to the next section, which addressed internal operations rather than public policy. According to the narrative, the people most directly affected by her leadership were not ideological opponents, but her own staff. He cited complaints described as anonymous but formal, filed through official channels and documented under oath. Reading selectively, he conveyed allegations of excessive demands, unpaid labor, and retaliatory behavior. The language, he emphasized, came not from adversaries, but from individuals who had believed in her mission strongly enough to work for her. He presented the accounts not as definitive judgments, but as testimonies that complicated the public image she projected. Her response was strained. She challenged the credibility of the claims, characterizing them as unverified grievances. He countered by noting the legal context in which they were submitted. In his telling, these were not casual complaints, but sworn statements offered at personal risk. He closed that portion of the folder and acknowledged that inconsistency alone did not constitute illegality. It was, as he framed it, a matter of integrity rather than criminality. He then turned the page. The tone shifted. He introduced the next section with deliberate care, signaling that the discussion was moving beyond optics and into substance. The issue now, according to this narrative, was money. Not in abstract terms, but in traceable flows and documented transactions. He referenced a cumulative figure spanning several years, contextualizing it within a network of organizations linked by overlapping leadership and financial relationships. The diagram he produced resembled a web more than a chart. Lines connected political action committees, limited liability companies, and consulting firms in a pattern that, in his telling, obscured accountability, rather than clarified it. He explained the structure patiently, as though addressing not just the committee, but the public watching from home. Donations entered the system through entities marketed as grassroots-driven, fueled by small contributions from individuals who believed they were supporting reform. From there, the funds moved through intermediaries labeled as service providers. Each step, he suggested, added distance between the donor and the final recipient. She attempted to dismiss the explanation as routine political practice. He acknowledged that political finance was complex, then distinguished complexity from opacity. According to the records he referenced, certain transactions lacked corresponding documentation. Services were billed, but outcomes were undefined. Payments were recorded, but deliverables were absent. He cited oversight bodies that had flagged these arrangements. Investigations, he noted, had stalled, not for lack of concern, but due to institutional gridlock. Other agencies, he suggested, were not constrained in the same way. As he concluded this portion, her attorney appeared increasingly agitated, writing rapidly while avoiding eye contact. The room remained quiet, attentive, and tense. The narrative was no longer unfolding as a clash of personalities. It had become something else entirely. He did not immediately name the next subject. Instead, he allowed a brief pause, as though acknowledging that what followed would shift the tone of the room in a more personal direction. When he finally spoke again, his voice remained steady, but the cadence slowed, signaling a transition away from institutional abstractions toward individual relationships. According to the narrative he presented, the next matter involved a person well known to the Congresswoman but largely unfamiliar to the public. He identified this individual as her longtime partner, describing him not as a political strategist or communications professional, but as someone whose professional background lay outside the sphere of electoral operations. The distinction, he implied, mattered. He produced payment records, arranging them neatly on the table. In this account, the documents indicated recurring monthly transfers from campaign-affiliated entities to the individual in question. The stated purpose, he noted, was marketing consultation. The amounts were not framed as shocking in isolation, but when aggregated over time, they formed a sum that demanded explanation. He articulated the question plainly. What, according to the records available, had been produced in exchange for these payments? What strategies had been documented? What campaigns bore evidence of this work? He did not raise his voice or gesture broadly. The absence of theatrics made the inquiry feel more pointed. Silence followed. He answered his own question cautiously, emphasizing that the conclusion was derived from the absence of evidence rather than an assertion of intent. In the materials he claimed to have reviewed, there were no portfolios, no strategy memoranda, no correspondence outlining deliverables. The individual's name appeared consistently on payment lines, but nowhere else. She responded defensively, asserting that the work had been real, ongoing, and valuable. He acknowledged the assertion and invited corroboration. According to his account, none was provided. He then shifted the focus outward, away from political insiders and toward an ordinary supporter. He introduced her not as a symbol, but as a person, a resident of the district, a working parent, someone whose relationship to the political process was defined not by influence, but by trust. He described her circumstances with care, emphasizing routine rather than tragedy. 2 jobs, long hours, modest wages, no surplus. In this telling, her contribution to the campaign was small in absolute terms, but significant relative to her means. He framed the donation as an act of belief rather than strategy. The contrast was allowed to stand on its own. Funds contributed by individuals like her, he suggested, entered the same financial pathways that led to private payments. He did not accuse her donation of being misused in isolation. Instead, he illustrated how collective contributions, when pooled and redirected, could support outcomes donors never envisioned. Her reaction was restrained but visible. She blinked rapidly, her expression tightening. When she attempted to respond, her words came slowly, framed as objections to characterization rather than denial of the underlying transactions. He proceeded to introduce a different type of evidence. This time, it was not financial but communicative. An email, according to the narrative, sent from her personal account to a senior aide. he read selectively, emphasizing language that suggested intentional distancing between donors and beneficiaries. The phrasing, as presented, implied awareness rather than confusion. He paused after reading, allowing the words to settle. He did not comment immediately, nor did he offer interpretation beyond noting that the language appeared deliberate. The distinction between error and instruction, he implied, was central. The atmosphere in the room shifted again. Members who had remained passive now appeared visibly uncomfortable. Eyes lowered. Papers were rearranged unnecessarily. No one interrupted. He summarized the cumulative figure attributed to funds that, in this account, flowed toward entities controlled by individuals within her immediate circle. The number was delivered without emphasis. It did not need it. He then acknowledged a limitation. Not all funds, he noted, could be traced with equal clarity. Some originated beyond domestic donor networks. It was at this point that the narrative moved into a darker register. He introduced a moment that had defined her public image. A photograph, widely circulated, emotionally resonant. In his telling, it marked a turning point, transforming her from a local political figure into a national symbol. He described the image with restraint, focusing on its impact rather than its composition. The photograph, he explained, conveyed grief and moral urgency. It had been shared millions of times, amplified by media outlets and advocacy groups alike. It framed her as a witness to suffering, overcome by the human cost of policy. He acknowledged the power of the image. Then, gently, he complicated it. According to the account he presented, additional photographs existed from the same sequence, taken minutes apart, same location, same participants. In these images, the emotional tone shifted noticeably. The tears were absent, smiles appeared, the posture relaxed. The performance, as he framed it, had a beginning and an end. She objected immediately, asserting that her emotional response had been genuine. He did not dispute her feelings directly. Instead, he introduced communications from her team earlier that day. Messages, he claimed, that referenced positioning, timing, and visual impact. The language he read was clinical, strategic, focused on outcomes rather than experience. He emphasized that the phrasing suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. He followed with another message, this one sent after the image had circulated widely. In this narrative, it referenced fundraising potential and urgency. The implication was not that compassion was absent, but that it had been operationalized. Her voice wavered as she spoke of her commitment to the issue. He acknowledged the claim, then shifted to action. He referenced calendars, schedules, and records of official visits. According to his account, the site of that defining moment had not been revisited by her in a substantive capacity. He contrasted this with the volume of media appearances, interviews, photo features, documentaries, all framed around the same issue. The discrepancy between visibility and engagement was left unexplained. He then addressed rhetoric. The language she had used publicly, he noted, was among the most severe available. Comparisons, labels, accusations. He suggested that such language, while effective in mobilizing attention, carried consequences beyond intent. He referenced reports of confrontations, protests, escalations, individuals injured. The details were delivered without dramatization. The connection drawn was not direct causation, but contextual influence. At this point, she did not respond. He turned to legislative output. According to the documents he presented, her record consisted primarily of symbolic measures. Statements, resolutions, declarations. He did not dismiss their value entirely, but noted their limitations. In this telling, substantive change had remained elusive. He then returned to fundraising. Donations surged following moments of heightened attention. Advocacy groups aligned with maximalist positions contributed heavily. Some, he noted, had attracted scrutiny from oversight bodies. He did not allege wrongdoing by association, but questioned diligence. Her reaction was sharp. She objected to the implication. He responded by producing a report, identifying organizations by name. He asked whether questions had been asked before funds were accepted. No answer followed. He concluded the section by framing the broader impact. Migration, he said, was not theoretical. It involved risk, exploitation, and loss. In this narrative, political messaging that simplified reality carried costs borne by the vulnerable. He closed the tab. The room felt heavier. He announced that the final section would address perception rather than policy. Not what she said publicly, but what she allegedly expressed privately. He warned that it would be uncomfortable, not for her alone, but for those who had believed in her. He paused, then opened the folder again. He did not rush into the final section. Instead, he adjusted the papers before him, aligning their edges with a care that suggested gravity rather than habit. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective, as though acknowledging that what followed would resonate beyond the walls of the chamber. According to the account he presented, this portion of the narrative concerned not legislation, finance, or public messaging, but perception. Specifically, it addressed how the Congresswoman was said to view the people who had elevated her to national prominence. He framed it as the most consequential issue of all, not because it carried the severest penalties, but because it touched on trust. He began by describing a major economic decision that had once defined her district's trajectory. The proposed development, announced with significant fanfare, promised large-scale investment and employment opportunities. In this narrative, the project had been positioned as transformative, with projections outlining thousands of jobs and long-term economic growth. He reviewed her public opposition to the proposal. She had framed it as resistance to corporate influence, emphasizing concerns about public subsidies and displacement. The rhetoric, he noted, had been compelling and effective. Protests followed. Public pressure mounted. Eventually, the project was withdrawn. At the time, the outcome had been celebrated by her supporters as a victory for grassroots activism. In this account, however, the story did not end there. He produced an email attributed to her personal correspondence. He introduced it cautiously, emphasizing that it was presented here as part of a narrative compiled by investigators, not as an uncontested fact. The message, he explained, was sent shortly after the project's cancellation to a private donor. The language he read suggested satisfaction, not merely with the public outcome, but with its political implications. According to the text, the arrival of higher-income professionals might have altered the district's electorate in ways unfavorable to her long-term prospects. Stability, in this framing, was equated with maintaining an existing voter base. The room was silent. He did not editorialize. He allowed the implication to stand, observing only that the reasoning, if accurately represented, framed economic stagnation not as an unfortunate consequence, but as a strategic preference. Her response was fragmented. She attempted to reframe the message as misinterpreted, extracted from a broader conversation. He invited clarification, but she did not offer a detailed explanation. The silence that followed felt heavier than rebuttal. He then transitioned to communications of a more private nature. According to the narrative, investigators had obtained access to personal text messages exchanged with long-standing acquaintances. He stressed that these messages were not intended for public consumption, and it was precisely for that reason that they were relevant. He read excerpts slowly, deliberately. The language, as presented, conveyed a dismissive attitude toward constituents, characterizing them as predictable and easily influenced. The phrasing suggested a separation between public advocacy and private belief. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A staff member exited quietly. Others stared at the table, unwilling to look toward the witness stand. She attempted to object, describing the messages as venting, as exaggerated expressions of frustration. He acknowledged that private speech often differed from public tone. The issue, he suggested, was not emotional release, but contempt. He posed a simple question. What context, he asked, transformed disdain into dedication? He did not wait for an answer. He moved next to staffing decisions. According to the documents he referenced, her congressional office was staffed primarily by individuals from outside the district. Many held elite educational credentials. Few had lived in the community she represented. He did not criticize education or expertise. Instead, he questioned representation. In this narrative, opportunities that might have empowered local residents were instead directed elsewhere. The people tasked with engaging the community, he suggested, did not reflect it. He introduced another document concerning outreach efforts. The individual assigned to cultural liaison duties, he noted, lacked fluency in the language most commonly spoken by constituents. The contrast between symbolic representation and functional connection was left unresolved. Her reaction was muted. Tears streaked through carefully applied makeup. When she spoke, her words came slowly, shaped more by emotion than argument. She referenced heritage, identity, and lived experience. He responded without hostility. He acknowledged her background, then contextualized it. According to the narrative, she had grown up in relative comfort, far from the conditions she often described. There was nothing inherently disqualifying about that, he said. The issue arose only when personal history was reshaped to serve political branding. He described this as appropriation rather than deception. The experiences of others, he suggested, had been repackaged and monetized. Their struggles became shorthand, their pain a backdrop for ambition. He closed the folder. The room no longer felt adversarial. It felt exhausted. When she finally spoke, it was to request the opportunity to respond formally. Her voice was unsteady, but resolute. She framed the proceedings as an orchestrated attack, driven by fear of change. She described the evidence as distorted, the intent as malicious. Her rhetoric regained some of its familiar cadence. She spoke of movements, of solidarity, of resilience. She challenged the motives of her accuser directly, questioning his credibility and intentions. When she finished, the room waited. He reached once more into his briefcase and produced a final set of documents. These, he explained, related to cooperation agreements. Former aides, associates, individuals who had once been central to her operation. According to the account, they had provided records, correspondence, and testimony. The materials presented throughout the day, he said, did not originate from speculation, but from those who knew the structure intimately. Her expression collapsed. She turned instinctively toward colleagues seated nearby, searching for reassurance. None came. He summarized their public statements, noting their careful neutrality, their distance, their silence. He did not mock her isolation. He observed it. When the chair addressed the room, his words were procedural, measured, and final. Referrals would be prepared. Reviews initiated. Counsel recommended. The gavel struck. As she attempted to rise, her legs faltered. Assistance was offered, refused. She steadied herself and walked toward the exit as cameras flashed relentlessly. Questions filled the air. She answered, none. Outside the chamber, the narrative continued to unfold at a pace no one could control. Media coverage expanded, commentary multiplied, Statements were issued, support fractured. He appeared only briefly that evening, declining celebration. He described the outcome not as victory, but as exposure. He emphasized process over judgment. Days later, according to the account, her resignation was submitted. It was brief, non-admissive, forward-looking. Investigations continued. In the district she had represented, life proceeded with familiar urgency. Work shifts resumed. Bills accumulated. Faith, once invested, did not return so easily. The narrative ended not with resolution, but with absence. Not with spectacle, but with quiet. And in that quiet, the distance between performance and consequence finally became visible. In the days that followed, the story did not resolve itself through a single announcement or decisive moment. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, dispersed across broadcasts, headlines, and private conversations. Each piece added weight without offering closure. The absence of immediacy, more than any spectacle, defined what came next. According to the narrative, media coverage intensified rapidly. Clips from the hearing circulated widely, stripped of context, and replayed in loops. Commentators framed the events through familiar lenses, some emphasizing accountability, others warning of political overreach. The interpretations varied, but the visibility did not. The story refused to recede. Within her party, responses emerged cautiously. Statements were released with deliberate ambiguity, expressing concern without endorsement, distance without condemnation. The language suggested calculation rather than conviction. Support, once vocal, became conditional. Silence filled the spaces where defense might have been expected. Behind the scenes, processes advanced methodically. Requests were filed, documents reviewed, timelines reconstructed. The pace was slow, governed by procedure rather than emotion. In this telling, the machinery of oversight moved without urgency, but also without interruption. She withdrew from public view. Scheduled appearances were canceled. Social media accounts went quiet. The platforms that had once amplified her voice now reflected absence. In their place, speculation flourished. The narrative then shifted away from institutions and returned to individuals. It described supporters encountering the story not as abstract controversy, but as personal reckoning. Donations once given with pride were reconsidered with discomfort. Belief, once affirmed, became tentative. One supporter, introduced earlier as emblematic rather than exceptional, watched coverage from a modest apartment. The television was outdated, the signal imperfect, but the meaning was clear enough. She held a printed receipt, yellowed with time, representing a contribution that had felt significant when it was made. In this account, her reaction was not anger, but confusion. She replayed speeches she had once admired, searching for sincerity. The disconnect between promise and portrayal unsettled her more than any allegation. It was not the money she regretted, but the trust she had extended. When asked what she felt now, she did not speak of betrayal in political terms. She spoke instead of hesitation, of caution, of a reluctance to believe again. The damage, as she described it, was not transactional, but emotional. Across the district, similar conversations unfolded. In laundromats and late-night diners, in break rooms and shared apartments, people discussed the story quietly. Not everyone agreed on its meaning. Some defended, others doubted. But the certainty that had once unified them was gone. The narrative returned briefly to the man who had presented the account. He declined extended commentary. When pressed, he framed his role narrowly. Exposure, he said, was not judgment. Evidence spoke, process followed. Asked whether he felt satisfaction, he hesitated. The word did not fit comfortably. In his view, the outcome represented failure rather than success. A failure of restraint, a failure of accountability, exercised too late. He reflected on potential unrealized, on the difference between capacity and outcome. In this telling, the tragedy lay not in consequence, but in squandered opportunity. As weeks passed, attention shifted elsewhere, as it often did. New stories emerged. Outrage found new targets. Yet, the effects lingered quietly, where belief had once been strong. The investigation continued, unresolved within the frame of the narrative. Questions remained open, outcomes uncertain. What endured was not a verdict, but an absence of trust. The account concluded not with finality, but with pause, a recognition that public life left marks beyond headlines. That rhetoric, once detached from responsibility, carried costs borne unevenly. In this version of events, the story did not end with applause or condemnation. It ended with distance, between words and actions, between image and reality, between those who spoke for others and those who believed them. And that distance, once revealed, proved difficult to close.